Today, Mercedes-Benz represents wealth, power, and engineering perfection. It's a symbol of success, of status, of having made it. From private driveways to red carpets to the motorcades of world leaders. But the story of Mercedes-Benz does not begin with luxury. It doesn't begin with chrome or prestige or perfection. It begins with poverty, with a boy born into hardship, in a world where horses ruled the road, and the idea of a machine replacing them was considered ridiculous, even dangerous. That boy would grow up obsessed with motion, with mechanics, with the impossible idea of bringing a machine to life. He would invent something the world had never seen before, something that would change transportation forever. And then, he would lose it. He would be pushed aside, stripped of control, and forced to watch others reshape his creation, while his name slowly faded into the background. But that wasn't the end. Because as the automobile spread across the world, history took a darker turn. Innovation turned into industry. Industry turned into power, and power, in the wrong hands, turned into something far more dangerous. During the most violent chapter of the 20th century, the same company known today for luxury became deeply entangled in war. Its factories no longer built dreams. They built weapons. Its workforce no longer came by choice, but by force. Prisoners of war, civilians, and detainees from concentration camps were pushed into its plants, working under brutal conditions, fueling an empire that survived while millions did not. This is not a simple success story. It's a story of brilliance and blindness, of vision and ego, of progress that came at a cost. It's the story of how the automobile was born, how a company rose to the top of the world, and how history left scars that can never be polished away. This is the story of Mercedes-Benz, and of the man who brought automobiles to life, Karl Benz. Karl Benz wasn't born into opportunity. He was born into survival. Karl Benz entered the world in 1844 in a small German town during a time when life was short, unforgiving, and brutally unequal. His family wasn't wealthy. They weren't connected. They didn't belong to the elite circles that shaped industry and politics. They lived modestly, relying on a single income to get by. His father was a locomotive driver, a working man, someone who traded long hours and physical strain for just enough money to keep his family afloat. There were no safety nets, no second chances, no backup plans. And when Karl was just 2 years old, that fragile stability disappeared. His father died suddenly. In the mid-19th century, losing the family's only breadwinner wasn't just a tragedy. It was a sentence. It meant hunger. It meant debt. It meant slipping one step closer to the margins of society where most people never escaped. From that moment on, Karl's world revolved around survival. His mother was left alone to raise him in a society that offered women little power and even fewer opportunities. There were no inheritance laws that protected widows the way they do today. No government support programs, no forgiveness from creditors. Everything depended on her. And she made a decision that would quietly change history. Instead of pulling her son out of school to work, instead of surrendering to circumstance, she chose education. She believed that knowledge, discipline, structure, learning was the only way out. Not wealth, not luck, education. That belief came at a cost. Food was scarce. Comfort was non-existent. There were nights when going to bed hungry was simply part of life. But school was never optional. From an early age, Karl showed signs that something about him was different. He wasn't the strongest. He wasn't the loudest. He wasn't particularly social. But he was curious in a way that bordered on obsessive. He wanted to know how things worked. Machines fascinated him. Not just what they did, but why they did it. While other children accepted the world as it was, Karl questioned it. He took things apart in his mind, imagining gears, forces, and systems hidden beneath the surface. Chemistry, mechanics, physics. Subjects most students struggled with came naturally to him. But talent alone doesn't guarantee success, especially not in a world stacked against you. Karl had no family name to protect him, no mentors waiting to open doors, no financial cushion to soften failure. Every mistake mattered. Every missed opportunity carried weight. At just 15 years old, an age when most boys were still considered children, Karl sat for the entrance exam to study mechanical engineering at the Karlsruhe Polytechnic. Passing it wasn't just impressive. It was almost unheard of. He wasn't stepping into higher education. He was stepping into a different social class. Karlsruhe exposed him to ideas that would shape the rest of his life. It was here that he encountered a new way of thinking about engineering, not as manual labor, but as science, systems, theory, precision. And one teacher, in particular, would leave a lasting mark. Ferdinand Redenbacher believed that the dominant technology of the era, steam power, was already reaching its limits. Steam engines powered trains and ships, but they were heavy, inefficient, and restrictive. They demanded infrastructure, tracks, rails, fixed routes. Redenbacher believed the future belonged to something smaller, lighter, more personal. Karl listened. Outside the classroom, he rode bicycles obsessively, not for sport, not for leisure, but because bicycles represented freedom. They moved without tracks, without animals, without massive engines. And slowly, an idea began to take shape. What if movement didn't require horses? What if transportation didn't depend on rails or steam? What if a machine could carry a person anywhere independently? At the time, the idea bordered on insanity. Horses weren't just transportation, they were the backbone of society. Entire economies revolved around them. Cities were built to support them. Roads existed because of them. Suggesting that a machine could replace the horse wasn't innovative. It was offensive. People laughed. Engineers dismissed it as fantasy. Businessmen saw no market. Investors saw only risk. Karl heard all of it. But doubt wasn't new to him. He had grown up doubted, overlooked, underestimated. After graduating, Karl drifted from job to job. Construction firms, engineering shops, foundries, none of them fit. He struggled to adapt to rigid hierarchies. He clashed with authority. He cared more about ideas than obedience. To his employers, he was difficult. To himself, he was restless. But every failure taught him something. Every short-lived job added another tool to his mental toolbox. By the time he reached his mid-20s, Karl was broke, exhausted, and deeply dissatisfied, but more determined than ever. He had seen enough of the industry to know one thing for certain. If he wanted to build the future, he couldn't do it working for someone else. So in 1871, with almost no money and no safety net, Karl took a risk that would have terrified most people. He started his own workshop. It was small, crude, barely operational. He partnered with a mechanic whose reliability would soon prove questionable. Equipment was expensive. Orders were scarce. Debt piled up quickly. This wasn't the glamorous beginning of a legend. It was desperation disguised as ambition. Bills went unpaid. Creditors circled. Local authorities eventually confiscated his tools. For many, this would have been the end. But Karl Benz had already learned something critical in life. Failure wasn't fatal. Quitting was. And standing beside him, quietly, decisively, was the one person who would make survival possible. His mother had taught him discipline, but it would take someone else to save his dream, and her story was only just beginning. In the late 19th century, the future seemed obvious. If you wanted to move people or goods, you used horses. If you wanted power, you used steam. That was the world everyone accepted. Cities were built around stables. Roads were designed for hooves and wheels pulled by animals. Entire industries existed to feed, breed, and maintain horses. Steam engines, meanwhile, were considered the pinnacle of human progress. They powered trains across continents. They moved ships across oceans. They symbolized industrial strength. Steam was loud, massive, impressive. And to most engineers of the time, steam was the answer to everything. So when Karl Benz began talking about a different idea, the reaction was immediate and brutal. A small engine, lightweight, fueled by gasoline, powering an individual vehicle not tied to rails or tracks. To many, it sounded childish. Why would anyone trust a machine that small? Why replace a horse that already works? Why abandon steam, the most powerful technology mankind had ever built? Engineers laughed. Businessmen shook their heads. Some warned him that even attempting such a thing could ruin his career before it ever began. Steam engines were visible symbols of progress. You could see their power, hear it, feel it. Gasoline engines, by comparison, looked fragile, unreliable, dangerous. There was also fear. Steam was centralized, controlled. It required infrastructure, permits, investment. Gasoline engines threatened something different: individual freedom of movement. Anyone could own one. Anyone could go anywhere. That kind of change rarely comes without resistance. Karl Benz didn't just challenge a technology, he challenged an entire worldview. At the time, early self-propelled vehicles already existed, but nearly all of them relied on steam. They were heavy, slow to start, and often impractical. Some required nearly an hour just to build pressure before moving an inch. Benz studied them carefully. He saw their flaws immediately. Steam engines needed constant water. They overheated. They demanded complex systems just to function. More importantly, they were never designed for personal transportation. To Benz, steam wasn't the future. It was a dead end. Gasoline, however, was different. It was volatile, compact, energy-dense. If harnessed correctly, it could do something steam never could: power a vehicle small enough for one person to own and operate. But seeing potential and convincing the world are two very different things. Benz worked in isolation, often late into the night, sketching designs that no one around him took seriously. He experimented constantly, refining engines, failing, starting again. Each failure reinforced what his critics already believed, that he was chasing a fantasy. He didn't look like a revolutionary. He didn't speak like a salesman. He didn't dress like someone destined to change the world. He looked like a stubborn engineer who refused to let go of a bad idea. And the pressure mounted. Money was always tight. Hearts were expensive. Time was working against him. Every month without success made his idea look less visionary and more delusional. Even fellow engineers, people trained to imagine the future, dismissed him. They argued that gasoline engines were too unstable, too weak, too unpredictable. Some warned that if his machines ever worked, they would explode. Others believed they would terrify the public. Loud, smelly, uncontrollable. And perhaps worst of all, There was no clear market. Why would anyone buy such a machine? It wasn't faster than a horse. It wasn't more comfortable. It wasn't cheaper. From a business perspective, it made no sense. But Karl Benz wasn't thinking like a businessman. He was thinking like an engineer obsessed with possibility. Where others saw limitations, he saw iteration. Where others saw danger, he saw refinement. Where others saw tradition, he saw inertia. He believed that progress didn't come from perfect ideas, but from stubborn ones, the kind of ideas that survive ridicule, the kind that endure years of failure, the kind that look foolish right up until they work. Benz understood something most people didn't. Revolutions don't announce themselves as revolutions. They begin as inconveniences, small, awkward, unimpressive. And that's exactly what his engine was. Small, awkward, unimpressive. But it was also different. It didn't need rails. It didn't need horses. It didn't need steam. It just needed time. As the years passed, Benz refined his designs relentlessly. He experimented with ignition systems, fuel delivery, cooling mechanisms, speed regulation. Each improvement brought him closer, but never close enough to silence his critics. By the late 1870s, the pressure reached a breaking point. Karl Benz was no longer just risking his reputation. He was risking everything: his finances, his marriage, his future. Banks were losing patience. Partners were questioning his priorities. Friends urged him to give up. They told him to focus on what worked, on selling engines for factories, on building safe, profitable machines. But that was never the dream. The dream was motion without limits. And in 1879, after years of trial and error, Benz finally achieved something no one else had managed to stabilize: a functional gasoline engine. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't powerful, but it worked. To Benz, it wasn't just an engine, it was proof. Proof that steam wasn't inevitable. Proof that horses weren't permanent. Proof that the world could move differently. But outside his workshop, nothing changed. The laughter didn't stop. The skepticism didn't fade. The system didn't budge. Because the world rarely notices the moment before everything shifts. And Karl Benz was still just one man standing against centuries of tradition, with an idea everyone thought was ridiculous. What he didn't yet realize was that this idea wouldn't just challenge transportation. It would challenge ownership, industry, power, and soon, it would cost him far more than he ever imagined. By the early 1870s, Karl Benz had learned a brutal truth. Having a revolutionary idea doesn't protect you from reality. In fact, it often does the opposite, because ideas don't pay rent. Ideas don't satisfy banks. Ideas don't stop creditors from knocking on your door, and Karl Benz was drowning in debt. After years of unstable employment, he believed independence was the only way forward. If the world wouldn't understand his vision, he would build it himself. So he partnered with a mechanic named August Ritter and opened a small iron foundry and mechanical workshop in Mannheim. On paper, it made sense. Ritter would handle day-to-day operations. Benz would focus on engineering. Together, they would survive long enough for innovation to catch up. But reality was far less forgiving. Ritter turned out to be unreliable, disorganized, uncommitted. Orders were missed. Deadlines slipped. Bills went unpaid. Tools were repossessed by local authorities. Suppliers refused to extend credit. The workshop barely stayed open. What little money came in disappeared immediately. And once again, Karl Benz found himself on the edge of collapse. This wasn't just a business failure. It was personal. Because Karl had staked everything on this venture: his reputation, his future, his belief that persistence alone could bend reality, and it nearly broke him. At this point, many inventors would have walked away, returned to safe employment, buried their ideas in notebooks and memory. But Karl Benz had never lived safely. Standing beside him during this chaos was a woman who understood exactly what was at stake, perhaps better than he did. Bertha. She came from a wealthier background. She had options. She could have chosen stability. Instead, she chose belief. When Ritter's failures threatened to destroy the company entirely, Bertha made a decision that would quietly change everything. She used her own dowry, her personal financial security, to buy out Ritter's share of the business. In one move, she removed the dead weight. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't symbolic. It was survival. For the next decade, Karl and Bertha lived in constant uncertainty. Their workshop survived, but barely. Every profit was reinvested. Every breakthrough was followed by another setback. Karl worked obsessively. He refined engines, developed ignition systems, improved fuel delivery, solved mechanical problems one by one. By 1879, his efforts finally paid off. Karl Benz developed a workable gasoline two-stroke engine. It wasn't glamorous, but it was reliable. And more importantly, it was sellable. To stay afloat, Karl began patenting his inventions: speed regulation systems, electric ignition, spark plugs, carburetors, clutches, gear shifts, water-cooled radiators. These weren't just components. They were the foundation of modern automotive engineering. Ironically, Karl Benz was inching closer to changing the world while still struggling to pay his bills. Production costs kept rising. Research wasn't cheap. Machinery demanded maintenance. Workers needed wages. Banks began to circle. They saw potential, but not sustainability. And in the early 1880s, they issued an ultimatum. If Benz wanted continued financing, his business had to be incorporated. At first glance, incorporation sounded like progress. It meant legitimacy, structure, stability, but it came with a price: control. By incorporating, Karl was forced to accept outside investors, men whose priority wasn't invention, but return on investment. They didn't care about horseless carriages. They cared about balance sheets. Slowly, quietly, power shifted. Decisions were no longer made in the workshop. They were made in boardrooms. Engineering vision gave way to financial caution. And Karl Benz, despite being the mind behind the machines, found himself increasingly sidelined. By 1882, the transformation was complete. The company Karl had built was now a joint stock corporation. And Karl Benz owned just 5% of it. 5%. The man who had spent his life chasing an idea, who had sacrificed stability, reputation, and comfort, now had virtually no say in the future of his own work. His role was reduced, his opinions dismissed, his ideas ignored. Executives questioned his priorities. Managers criticized his obsession with experimental projects. Accountants demanded predictable returns. Karl Benz had become an employee in his own company. Worse still, his colleagues no longer trusted his judgment. New products were designed without his input. Strategic decisions were made behind closed doors. To them, Karl wasn't a visionary. He was a liability. For a man who had endured poverty, ridicule, and failure, this was the deepest cut of all. Not because he lost money, but because he lost ownership of his dream. The system he had trusted, the institutions meant to support innovation, had turned against him. Legally, quietly, irreversibly. Frustration turned into resentment. Resentment turned into resolve. In 1883, Karl Benz made a decision few inventors ever recover from. He walked away. He left the company that bore his life's work, not because he had failed, but because success had been taken from him. The man who invented the automobile lost control of his own invention. For most people, this would have been the end. A cautionary tale about genius without business sense. A warning about trusting investors. A footnote in industrial history. But Karl Benz wasn't finished. Because what he lost in ownership, he gained in clarity. He now understood the rules of the game. Innovation alone wasn't enough. Persistence wasn't enough. Talent wasn't enough. To survive, he would need independence again. With Bertha still at his side, Karl partnered with new allies who understood machinery and trusted his judgment. Together, they formed a new company focused on stationary gas engines. This time, it worked. The business was profitable. Orders were steady. Employees were paid. For the first time in years, Karl Benz had breathing room. And with stability came focus. Focus on the idea that had never left him. Not engines for factories, not machines for profit, but a vehicle. A true horseless carriage. Not an engine attached to a carriage, but a carriage built around an engine. What Karl didn't yet know was that the greatest betrayal of his life would become the fuel for his greatest achievement. Because sometimes losing everything is the only way to start again. And the world was about to see what Karl Benz could build when no one else was allowed to tell him no. History often remembers inventors. It remembers founders. It remembers men whose names are carved into machines. But sometimes the most important figure in a revolution is the one history almost forgets. Her name was Bertha Benz. In the late 1880s, Karl Benz had built something extraordinary. A working automobile. It ran on gasoline. It moved without horses. It proved, at least mechanically, that the impossible was possible. But there was a problem. No one cared. The public didn't trust it. Investors didn't understand it. Even Karl's own business partners saw it as a distraction. To most people, the automobile was still a curiosity, a fragile toy, something that might work inside a workshop, but never in the real world. Sales were almost non-existent, and without proof that the car could actually be used outside controlled conditions, Karl's invention was dying, quietly, slowly. And Bertha could see it happening. She had watched her husband nearly lose everything before. She had seen him pushed out of his own company. She knew what failure looked like, and she knew it didn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrived as silence. So in the summer of 1888, Bertha Benz made a decision that would change history. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't inform the authorities. She didn't even tell her husband. Early one morning, before sunrise, while Karl was still asleep, Bertha quietly rolled his latest automobile out of the workshop. She brought their 2 teenage sons with her. And she began driving. Her destination was her mother's home in Forsheim, over 100 kilometers away. At the time, no automobile had ever attempted a journey even close to that distance. There were no road maps for cars, no signs, no fuel stations, no repair shops. The roads weren't roads at all. They were dirt paths built for horses and wagons, and Bertha knew all of this. That was the point. If the automobile was going to survive, it had to face the real world. Almost immediately, problems began. The engine overheated. Fuel ran low. The terrain was brutal dusty hills, uneven stone mud. At one point, the vehicle simply stopped. There was no one to call, no instructions to follow, no precedent. So Bertha improvised. When the fuel ran out, she stopped at a pharmacy, the only place gasoline, then used as a cleaning solvent, could be found. She became the world's first person to refuel a car. When the fuel line clogged, she cleared it herself using a hat pin. When the brakes failed on downhill roads, she invented a solution adding leather linings, effectively creating the first brake pads. When the engine struggled on inclines, she and her sons pushed, sometimes for miles. Villagers stared. Some laughed, some panicked. Others crossed themselves, convinced they were witnessing something unnatural. A woman driving a machine alone without horses through rural Germany. To many, it looked less like progress and more like madness. But Bertha kept going, hour after hour, failure after failure. Each breakdown wasn't a setback, it was data. She observed everything. What worked, what didn't, what needed improvement. This wasn't a joyride, it was a field test. By the time Bertha and her sons arrived in Pforzheim, after more than 12 exhausting hours, the impossible had happened. The automobile had crossed 106 kilometers of real terrain. It had climbed hills, survived breakdowns, adapted. It had proven itself. And more importantly, people had seen it. News spread quickly. Not through advertisements or announcements, but through shock. A machine had done what only horses could do, and it had done it without permission. When Karl Benz finally learned what his wife had done, he was stunned. Not just because she had taken the car, but because she had solved the problem he couldn't. Bertha didn't just demonstrate the automobile, she demonstrated belief. She showed the world that the car wasn't a prototype, it was a product. She returned home with notes, with suggestions, with solutions. A better braking system, improved fuel delivery, design changes based on real-world use. Karl listened. And for the first time, the automobile wasn't just an engineer's dream, it was a practical machine. Orders began to follow. The public's skepticism softened, not because they were convinced by theory, but because they had witnessed reality. A woman had driven a car across the countryside. If she could do it, so could they. History would later describe this moment as the first long-distance automobile journey. But at the time, it was something simpler. It was proof. Proof that innovation doesn't survive in isolation. It survives in action. Bertha Benz didn't just save her husband's invention. She saved the automobile itself. And yet, for decades, her role was reduced to a footnote. Because history often prefers heroes who invent over heroes who act. But without Bertha Benz, the automobile might have remained a failed experiment. A forgotten idea. Instead, it became inevitable. And from that moment forward, the world would never move the same way again. After Bertha Benz's journey, something shifted, not overnight. Not dramatically, but unmistakably. The automobile was no longer a rumor. It was no longer a workshop experiment. It had entered the real world and survived. For the first time, people weren't asking if the car worked. They were asking how it worked. And more importantly, how they could get one. Orders began to arrive, slowly at first, cautiously, from curious buyers willing to take a risk. And with that, Karl Benz did something no one had ever done before. He began manufacturing automobiles for sale, not as one-off inventions, not as demonstrations, but as products. This was the moment the automobile stopped being an idea and became an industry. By the early 1890s, Benz and C was producing vehicles consistently. Each car was still handcrafted, still expensive, still unfamiliar, but it was repeatable. And that alone changed everything. For the first time in history, a company existed for one purpose: to build automobiles. No horses, no steam, no rails, just machines. By the standards of the time, Karl Benz had won. His company grew rapidly. Orders expanded beyond Germany. Engines were sold across Europe. Factories scaled up, workers were hired, systems were built. By the mid-1890s, Benz and C had become the largest automobile manufacturer in the world. It sounds impossible now, but at the time, it was undeniable. Karl Benz, once mocked as a dreamer, now stood at the center of an entirely new industry, and yet, the seeds of the next conflict were already taking root. Because success doesn't freeze innovation, it invites competition. The cars Benz produced were reliable, well-engineered, predictable. They did exactly what Karl believed automobiles should do. They moved people safely, slowly, carefully. Karl Benz hated speed. He saw automobiles as tools, not toys. To him, reckless driving wasn't progress, it was danger. Roads were crowded. Regulations were non-existent. One accident could turn public opinion against the entire industry. So Benz favored caution. His vehicles were designed for stability, not excitement. For function, not spectacle. They were loud, they were rough, they were slow. And that was intentional. But while Benz focused on engineering discipline, the world was changing around him. A new generation of buyers didn't want careful. They wanted thrilling. They wanted speed. They wanted power. They wanted machines that didn't just move but impressed. Automobiles were no longer judged only by whether they worked. They were judged by how they felt. And Karl Benz didn't see it coming. Because the very thing that made him successful, his caution, was quietly becoming a weakness. As the automobile spread, public events began to emerge. Demonstrations, contests, races. At first, Karl dismissed them. Racing was irresponsible, unnecessary, dangerous. To Benz, racing had nothing to do with progress. It was spectacle without substance. But to the public, racing was proof of power, proof of reliability, proof of superiority. People didn't want to read specifications. They wanted to see machines pushed to their limits. And Benz refused. Inside his company, tension grew. Managers saw opportunity. Salesmen saw demand. Engineers saw potential. But Karl resisted. He rejected faster designs, refused radical changes, dismissed the idea of racing outright. He believed the automobile should earn trust slowly. But trust wasn't the currency of the new market. Attention was. While Benz stayed cautious, others moved aggressively. They built faster engines, louder machines, more daring designs. They embraced risk. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Benz's dominance began to erode. The irony was painful. Karl Benz had built the first true automobile company. He had proven the concept. He had created the market. But he was no longer shaping its direction. What began as an engineering revolution was turning into a cultural one. Cars weren't just transportation anymore. They were identity, status, competition. And Karl Benz, the man who invented the automobile, didn't like what it was becoming. He didn't want chaos on the roads. He didn't want machines pushed beyond reason. He didn't want speed for speed's sake. But the market didn't ask for permission. Sales numbers told a different story. Customers gravitated toward excitement, toward spectacle, toward machines that promised dominance, not discipline. Benz and C was still powerful, still profitable, still respected. But for the first time since the automobile's birth, it wasn't alone. Somewhere not far away, another group of engineers was working toward a different vision. A vision built around speed, around performance, around winning. And they didn't see automobiles as tools. They saw them as weapons. The era of careful innovation was ending, and the age of rivalry was about to begin. Every industry reaches a moment when success invites a challenger. For the automobile, that moment arrived quietly. Not with an announcement, not with a declaration of war, but with a very different way of thinking. While Karl Benz believed the future of the automobile should be careful, controlled, and practical, two other engineers were imagining something else entirely. Their names were Gottlieb Daimler and Wilhelm Maybach. Like Benz, they were pioneers. Like Benz, they were obsessed with engines. But unlike Benz, they weren't interested in restraint. They were interested in speed. To Daimler and Maybach, the automobile wasn't just a replacement for the horse. It was a chance to redefine power, to prove superiority, to dominate not just the road, but the imagination. Their philosophy was simple. Faster was better, louder was stronger, winning mattered. They believed that progress didn't come from caution, it came from pushing limits. And while Benz focused on reliability and safety, Daimler and Maybach focused on performance. Their engines were lighter, more powerful, more aggressive. They didn't worry about whether roads were ready. They believed roads would adapt. The difference between the two camps wasn't technical, it was ideological. Karl Benz saw automobiles as tools for everyday life. Machines that should integrate quietly into society, earning trust over time. Daimler and Maybach saw automobiles as statements. Machines meant to shock, impress, and outperform anything that came before them. And nowhere was that difference clearer than in racing. To Benz, racing was reckless. A publicity stunt with no long-term value. A risk that could undo everything the industry had worked to build. To Daimler, racing was proof. If a car could win under extreme conditions, it could win anywhere. If it could outrun competitors in public, it could dominate the market in private. Races weren't distractions, they were advertisements. And the public agreed. Crowds gathered wherever cars competed. Newspapers reported winners. Names became legends. Speed records turned into headlines. The automobile was becoming entertainment, and Karl Benz hated it. Inside Benz and C, pressure mounted. Sales teams pointed to Daimler's rising popularity. Engineers warned that falling behind in performance would eventually mean falling behind in relevance. But Karl resisted. He refused to let his cars race, refused to chase speed for spectacle, refused to compromise his principles. To him, this wasn't innovation. It was chaos, but history rarely waits for consensus. In 1901, Daimler and Maybach unveiled something that changed everything. A car that didn't just outperform competitors. It redefined what an automobile could be. It was called the Mercedes 35 horsepower. The name came from a wealthy businessman and racing enthusiast who commissioned the car and named it after his daughter Mercedes. At the time, the name meant nothing. Soon, it would mean everything. The Mercedes 35 HP didn't look like previous automobiles. It sat lower, wider, more stable. Its engine was powerful and efficient. Its weight distribution allowed unprecedented control at high speeds. This wasn't a modified carriage. It was the first modern car. Built initially for racing, It dominated competitions across Europe: hill climbs, street races, speed trials. It wasn't just winning. It was humiliating competitors. The public took notice immediately. For the first time, people didn't just see automobiles as practical tools. They saw them as symbols of superiority. And with that, the balance of power shifted. Daimler's cars became desirable, aspirational, prestigious. Meanwhile, Benz's vehicles, reliable as they were, began to look outdated, safe but boring, functional but uninspiring. Karl Benz watched this transformation unfold with growing unease. To him, Daimler's approach felt irresponsible. Cars were getting faster before infrastructure was ready. Accidents were increasing. Regulations didn't exist. He feared backlash. He feared government intervention. He feared public outrage. But fear doesn't stop momentum. And momentum was firmly on Daimler's side. Within Benz and C, conflict reached a boiling point. Executives demanded change. Investors demanded competitiveness. Designers pushed for faster models. Karl refused. He saw racing as a betrayal of the automobile's purpose. He believed progress should be measured in reliability, not records. But the market disagreed, and once again, Karl Benz found himself isolated. The man who created the automobile was now struggling to keep up with it. Eventually, his partners made a decision without him. They authorized the development of faster cars. They brought in external designers. They pursued racing against Karl's wishes. When Karl learned what they had done, he was furious. To him, it wasn't just a business disagreement, it was a violation. He had lost control again. Disillusioned and exhausted, Karl stepped back from day-to-day operations. He remained on the board, but his influence was fading. Ironically, once Benz cars began racing, success followed. Records were broken. Public interest surged. Sales stabilized. The very thing Karl had resisted saved his company. Meanwhile, Daimler's success continued to grow. The name Mercedes became synonymous with speed, innovation, and dominance. What began as a rivalry between companies had become something deeper, a conflict between philosophies. Caution versus ambition, stability versus spectacle, engineering discipline versus competitive hunger. This wasn't just competition. It was two visions of the future colliding. And neither side fully realized what lay ahead. Because while Benz and Daimler fought for supremacy, forces far larger than speed or safety were gathering. Economic collapse, political extremism, global war. Soon, rivalry would turn into necessity, and enemies would be forced to become partners. But before that happened, the automobile would change again, not through invention, but through ego. And the road forward would be far more dangerous than either man ever imagined. For Karl Benz, the automobile was never meant to be a weapon. It wasn't supposed to roar, it wasn't supposed to intimidate, and it certainly wasn't supposed to race. Karl Benz believed the future of the car depended on trust earned slowly, mile by mile. He believed that speed invited chaos. That chaos invited accidents. And accidents could turn public opinion against an entire industry that was still fighting for acceptance. So when racing took over the public imagination, Benz pushed back, hard. Inside his company, the debate grew louder. Sales teams argued that racing sold cars. Engineers argued that performance drove innovation. Investors argued that prestige followed victory. Karl argued none of it mattered if the automobile lost public trust. To him, racing wasn't progress, it was ego. But the world outside his workshop was changing faster than he was willing to admit. Newspapers didn't report cautious reliability. They reported winners. Crowds didn't gather to watch steady transportation. They gathered to watch speed. And while Karl Benz tried to protect the automobile from excess, his competitors were using excess to define it. The consequences were immediate. Benz and C began losing relevance. Not overnight, not catastrophically, but steadily. Their cars still worked. They were still reliable, still well built, but they didn't inspire. Customers wanted excitement. Dealers wanted headlines. The public wanted spectacle, and Benz was offering restraint. Inside boardrooms, patience thinned. Managers warned that refusing to adapt could be fatal. Engineers warned that innovation was moving on without them. Partners warned that pride was becoming a liability. Karl listened, but he didn't bend. To him, compromise meant surrender. He had already lost one company to financial forces. He refused to lose another to trends he didn't believe in. Then came the crisis. By the early 1900s, competition intensified. Daimler's racing successes dominated headlines. New manufacturers entered the market, inspired not by Benz's caution, but by Daimler's aggression. Benz and C faced falling sales, declining influence, internal division. For the second time in his life, Karl Benz stood on the edge of losing everything he had built. And once again, the system didn't wait for his consent. Without Karl's approval, his partners moved forward. They authorized racing programs. They invested in high-performance engines. They built machines designed not for safety, but for dominance. When Karl learned of the decision, he was devastated. This wasn't just a strategic disagreement. It was a betrayal of philosophy. The automobile he envisioned, controlled, purposeful, responsible, was becoming something he didn't recognize. For a time, Karl withdrew. He stepped away from daily operations, distanced himself from decisions, watched from the sidelines as his company chased speed. It felt like history repeating itself. Once again, Karl Benz, the inventor, was being left behind by the industry he created. But then, something unexpected happened. The racing cars worked. They didn't just compete, they dominated. Benz vehicles began breaking records, winning races, capturing attention. Headlines followed. Public interest surged. Machines that Karl feared would damage the automobile's reputation were instead elevating it, and the market responded. Sales stabilized. Prestige returned. The brand regained relevance. It was undeniable. Racing had saved the company. For Karl Benz, this realization was painful, because it meant confronting an uncomfortable truth. He had been wrong, not about safety, not about responsibility, but about survival. The world had changed. The automobile had evolved, and refusing to adapt was no longer an option. Slowly, reluctantly, Karl accepted the outcome. He didn't suddenly embrace racing. He didn't celebrate speed records. He didn't abandon his principles. But he understood that progress didn't belong to any one philosophy. It belonged to those willing to adjust. The very thing Karl had resisted, competition driven by ego, had forced his company to innovate beyond its comfort zone. Higher horsepower, improved handling, stronger engineering. The cars were better because they were tested harder. And Karl Benz, for the first time, saw the full picture. Innovation wasn't a straight line, it was a collision. Between caution and ambition, between discipline and desire, between ego and necessity. And survival required navigating that collision, not avoiding it. The irony was impossible to ignore. The man who invented the automobile nearly lost it again because he refused to let it become something new. But by stepping aside, by allowing forces he didn't fully trust to shape the future, Karl preserved what mattered most. The automobile survived, his company survived, and his legacy endured. By the late 1900s, years before global catastrophe would force even greater change, Benz and C stood once more as a leader in the automotive world. Not because it was the safest, not because it was the fastest, but because it learned to balance both. The lesson was harsh and deeply personal. Sometimes innovation demands patience. Sometimes it demands restraint. But sometimes survival demands letting go. Letting go of certainty. Letting go of control. Letting go of pride. Because in the end, progress doesn't care who was right first. It only remembers who adapted. And Karl Benz reluctantly, painfully did. But the greatest test was still ahead. Because forces far beyond racing were about to reshape the world. And this time, adaptation wouldn't be optional. War doesn't just destroy cities, it destroys certainty. When the First World War ended, Germany didn't step into peace. It collapsed into instability. The economy was shattered. Currency lost its value. Factories sat idle. Demand evaporated. For companies built on innovation and ambition, the post-war years weren't about growth anymore. They were about survival. For decades, two names had defined the automobile's birth: Karl Benz and Daimler. They had competed fiercely. They had chased different visions. They had built rival machines that represented opposing philosophies. One side believed in caution, the other in speed. One trusted patience, the other trusted spectacle. But now, none of that mattered, because the market didn't care about philosophy. It cared about efficiency. Inflation crushed purchasing power. Foreign competition tightened. Costs rose while customers vanished. The automotive industry, still young, still fragile, was suffocating. And even giants were bleeding. By the early 1920s, both companies were struggling. Production slowed. Profits vanished. Survival became uncertain. For years, pride had kept them apart. Now pride was a liability they could no longer afford. In 1924, discussions began, quiet at first. Carefully worded, strategic, not about victory, not about dominance, about endurance. Two former rivals reached an agreement to cooperate, sharing production, purchasing, and sales while retaining separate identities. It was a temporary truce, a pause in the war. But the economic reality only grew harsher. Germany's financial crisis deepened. The global market tightened. And it became clear that cooperation alone wouldn't be enough. In 1926, the unthinkable happened. Daimler and Benz merged. The rivals became one. A new company was born, Daimler-Benz. For the outside world, it was a strategic consolidation. For history, it was something far more symbolic. The two philosophies that had shaped the automobile's early years, speed and caution, ambition and discipline, were now forced to coexist under a single name. The merger wasn't clean, it wasn't emotional, it wasn't celebratory. It was necessary. Factories were reorganized. Product lines were streamlined. Costs were cut. Engineering teams, once competitors, now worked side by side. Ideas clashed. Egos collided. But slowly, something new emerged. A company larger than either of its predecessors. A brand capable of surviving the modern industrial world. And somewhere in the background of this transformation stood Karl Benz. He was still alive, old, now quiet. Watching. Karl Benz had lived long enough to see the entire arc of the automobile. He had seen it laughed at. He had seen it rejected. He had seen it betray him. He had watched others redefine it through speed, competition, and spectacle. And now, he was watching his legacy merge with the very rival that once threatened to eclipse it. For most founders, this moment would feel like erasure. But for Karl Benz, it was something else. Closure. The automobile had grown beyond him, beyond any single inventor, beyond any single company. What began as a stubborn idea in a small workshop had become a force too large to be controlled by one vision. And now, that force had consolidated. Daimler-Benz wasn't just a merger of companies, it was a merger of histories. Of lessons learned the hard way. Of mistakes paid for in bankruptcy and bloodshed. Of innovations shaped by rivalry. Under one roof, the company combined Benz's emphasis on reliability with Daimler's obsession with performance. It wasn't perfect, but it was resilient. As the late 1920s approached, Daimler-Benz released a series of impressive vehicles machines that blended luxury, engineering excellence, and power. For the first time, the automobile wasn't just transportation, it was identity. And Karl Benz saw it. He saw machines far more advanced than anything he had imagined in his youth. He saw roads filled with cars instead of horses. He saw a world that had accepted what once seemed impossible. Karl Benz passed away in 1929, just a few years after the merger. He died knowing that his life's work had not only survived, but become foundational. But history wasn't finished with Daimler-Benz. The world was changing again. Economic instability was giving way to political extremism. Nationalism was rising. And the industrial power of Germany would soon be redirected toward darker purposes. The merger that saved the company would also make it indispensable. Too big to ignore, too powerful to remain neutral. And as the next chapter of history unfolded, Daimler-Benz would face its greatest test, not of engineering, but of morality. In 1933, Germany changed direction. Economic collapse, political instability, and public anger created space for a new kind of leadership. And when Adolf Hitler rose to power, industry became a tool of the state. Technology was no longer just about progress. It was about projection, control, strength. And few industries symbolized German engineering better than the automobile. By this point, Mercedes-Benz was no longer just a manufacturer. It was a national icon. A symbol of technical excellence, industrial capacity, and prestige. The new regime took notice. Mercedes-Benz vehicles began appearing in state parades, diplomatic convoys, and official ceremonies. Large luxury models carried high-ranking officials. Racing successes were celebrated as national achievements. The brand became closely associated with power. This alignment was not accidental. The Nazi government invested heavily in German industry, and Daimler-Benz became a key beneficiary. Subsidies flowed into research, development, and production, especially in motorsports, where victories were used to project technological superiority to the world. But racing was only part of the story. As Germany prepared for war, priorities shifted, civilian demand declined, military demand exploded. Daimler-Benz factories were retooled. Passenger cars gave way to military trucks. Automobile engines gave way to aircraft engines. Production lines expanded to support tanks, vehicles, and components critical to the war effort. By the late 1930s, Daimler-Benz was deeply embedded in Germany's military-industrial system. This was not unique. It was systemic. Industrial survival increasingly depended on alignment with state objectives. When war broke out in 1939, that alignment became total. Civilian car production slowed, then stopped altogether. Resources were redirected toward armaments. Skilled workers were drafted into the military. Labor shortages followed. And that shortage forced a decision. To maintain production levels, Daimler-Benz, like many German companies, turned to alternative labor sources. First came women, recruited to replace men sent to the front. Then came prisoners of war. Then came forced laborers. Workers were brought in from occupied territories across Europe. Civilians abducted from their homes, posts captured on the battlefield. And later, detainees transferred from concentration camps. They were housed near factories, guarded, controlled. Conditions varied by location, but were consistently harsh. Long hours, insufficient food, inadequate shelter, constant supervision. For concentration camp detainees, conditions were far worse. They lived under SS control, subject to abuse, malnutrition, and punishment. By 1944, forced laborers made up nearly half of Daimler-Benz's workforce, tens of thousands of people working under coercion to sustain wartime production. The factories continued to operate. Engines rolled off assembly lines. Vehicles were delivered to the front. Aircraft components powered bombing campaigns. From an industrial perspective, the system functioned. From a human perspective, it was catastrophic. Many forced laborers did not survive. Some died from exhaustion, others from illness, others from mistreatment. Records from the period show that productivity targets mattered more than human cost. The company profited, not in the abstract, but in contracts fulfilled, resources allocated, and status preserved. This is the part of the story that cannot be reframed as innovation. It cannot be softened by context. It exists as fact. When the war turned against Germany, consequences followed. Allied bombing campaigns targeted industrial centers. Daimler-Benz plants were heavily damaged. Production collapsed. In 1945, the war ended. Germany was defeated. And the industrial system that had sustained the regime was dismantled. Under Allied agreements, German assets abroad were confiscated as reparations. Daimler-Benz lost subsidiaries, factories, and foreign holdings. Its international presence vanished overnight. At home, surviving plants lay in ruins. The company faced scrutiny. Executives were removed. Leadership was restructured. The process of denazification began. Daimler-Benz publicly acknowledged its use of forced labor. Decades later, the company would participate in compensation funds for surviving victims, an admission that what happened could not be undone, only recognized. But in 1945, none of that was certain. What remained was a broken company in a broken country. No global market, no civilian demand, no political protection, just ruins and a choice: to disappear or to rebuild. The same factories that once produced luxury cars, then weapons, now stood silent. And the future of Mercedes-Benz, like the future of Germany itself, was no longer about power or dominance. It was about whether survival was even possible. The darkest chapter was over, but the consequences of it would shape everything that came next. In 1945, the war ended. And what remained of Germany was silence. Cities lay in ruins. Factories were shattered. Rail lines were broken. Industry, once a source of national pride, had become a reminder of devastation. For Mercedes-Benz, the collapse was nearly total. Production facilities had been bombed. Foreign assets were confiscated. Subsidiaries were gone. Supply chains no longer existed. The brand that once symbolized engineering excellence now faced a single question. Could it exist at all? There was no market for luxury, no appetite for performance, no tolerance for excess. What people needed was survival, food, medical care, transportation for emergency services. And that is where Mercedes-Benz began again, not with prestige, not with speed, not with ambition, but with necessity. The first vehicles produced after the war weren't symbols of wealth. They were ambulances, police cars, delivery vans. Simple, functional, practical. They served cities struggling to rebuild, hospitals overwhelmed by casualties, streets filled with rubble instead of traffic. In these early years, Mercedes-Benz didn't sell dreams. It provided tools. The company worked under strict Allied oversight. Production permits were limited. Materials were scarce. Every decision was scrutinized. But slowly, methodically, factories reopened. Damaged equipment was repaired. Workers returned. Processes restarted. By 1947, passenger car production resumed on a small scale. Just over 1,000 vehicles were built that year. By any modern standard, it was insignificant. By post-war standards, it was a miracle. Against the odds, Mercedes-Benz turned a profit. Not because of innovation, not because of expansion, but because of discipline. The same traits that once made Karl Benz cautious. Attention to detail, engineering rigor, respect for reliability, now became strengths. While other manufacturers struggled to recover lost facilities, Mercedes-Benz retained its core plants within Germany's western zones. That alone provided an advantage. As Europe stabilized, demand slowly returned. First for basic transportation, then for quality, then for performance. By the early 1950s, Mercedes-Benz began reclaiming its identity. New passenger models appeared cleaner, more refined, better engineered. Cars designed not just to move people, but to restore confidence. And once again, motorsports returned. But this time, racing wasn't about spectacle. It was about redemption. Mercedes-Benz re-entered international competitions, not as a symbol of dominance, but as a demonstration of technical competence, precision, control, endurance. Victories followed, not immediately, not effortlessly, but convincingly. Each success signaled something larger. Germany was rebuilding, industry was adapting, and Mercedes-Benz was finding its place in a changed world. By the mid-1950s, the transformation was complete. Mercedes-Benz wasn't just a surviving company. It was a global brand. Its vehicles were sold across Europe, the Americas, and beyond. Luxury returned, but it was quieter, more restrained. Built on reputation rather than excess, engineering excellence became the message. Safety innovations, reliability standards, long-term durability. The company that once fueled war now emphasized responsibility. The brand that once symbolized power now marketed trust. This wasn't reinvention, it was evolution. Over the decades that followed, Mercedes-Benz expanded into every segment of the automotive world. Luxury sedans, commercial vehicles, performance cars, motorsports. Each chapter carried echoes of the past. The discipline of Karl Benz, the ambition of Daimler, the lessons of rivalry, the weight of history. None of it disappeared, it accumulated. Today, Mercedes-Benz stands as one of the most recognizable automotive brands on the planet, a symbol of engineering, of craftsmanship, of endurance. But that symbol wasn't built in a straight line. It was shaped by failure, by ego, by compromise, by moral reckoning. It survived ridicule. It survived bankruptcy. It survived war, and each survival left a mark. Because history doesn't reward perfection, it rewards persistence. Mercedes-Benz didn't just survive history. It was shaped by it.